Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Metaphysical Bible Hangout. I am Reverend Sherri James, Senior Minister of Understanding Principles, and I'm excited to be here. This is a great, great lesson. Like, okay, that's it. I don't want to oversell it. I'm gonna just get into it, and then you guys let me know. But I think that you're gonna find a lot of power in this lesson for yourself, and even while we're studying, of course, what is literally on the page, and that really is our mission. We have been using Reverend Mary's text, Student's Guide to the Hebrew Scriptures. If you would like to get a copy of this one, for whatever reason, this is your first visit to the Bible Hangout, or you just found it on YouTube, you can reach out to Universal Truth Center, which is the church that Reverend Mary Tompkins founded. Their phone number is 305-624-4991, and you can purchase a copy. We also have some additional copies on hand in our bookstore at church. So if you are local to LA, or if you want to support a church and purchase the book through us, you can do that. And you just give us a call at 310-412-7729. I'll put all that stuff down in the show notes, so you'll be able to get the book. It's very inexpensive. The book itself is $15, and then it's $7.50 for us to ship it anywhere in the U.S., and we also will ship internationally as well. And we found a way to do that pretty affordably too. So I am Senior Minister of this amazing community. We were founded by the Reverend Dr. Delarice Lett, who many of you know from Touched by an Angel, and she retired in 2015, and Reverend Sherri and I have been leading this ministry since that time. So I'm excited to be doing this study because I feel like really because we're metaphysicians and because we approach the Bible metaphysically, it's really important that we have an understanding of the underlying material, that we don't just want to just slap metaphysics on the Bible, but not actually know what's in the Bible. That was something that was important to Reverend Mary, and it's something that's important to me. So let's take a moment to just relax and open ourselves up for this amazing experience. I know that the Spirit has something for us. I know that each time that we come together, something wonderful happens. And it just gets gooder and gooder and gooder. And so I just bless this lesson right now. I thank God for his presence just operating in and through and as us. And I know that there is a transformation that's available to us, even in this academic study of the scriptures, that there is something here to ignite us, to turn us on, to awaken the power and presence of God in us. And I thank you, God, for just bringing that out in the lesson. In the name and the nature of Jesus the Christ, I affirm that it is so, and so it is, and amen. And let's get to it. All right. So I want to give you a little history. So one of the things that I brought up a couple of classes ago, this is a great Bible to have for studying the Hebrew scriptures. My ring light is giving it a little thing. I can't get that O off of there. But anyway, the Jewish Study Bible. Make it go away. It's a great makeup light, but it's a terrible light for lighting stuff. So the Jewish Study Bible is what it is. So I recommend picking up one. I think I got this for like $20 off of Amazon, but there's also a great site called thriftbooks.com, and there's some amazing research just right here in this Bible, meaning that you don't have to go sign up for an expensive theology degree. If you have an interest in the scriptures and you just want to know what's actually in there, this is a great resource. It is, and the good stuff is like right there. They're not hiding it from you. So the Exodus, one of the things about the Exodus is that it's really not an independent book. And in fact, none of the books are. This is what it says. It says Exodus in its present form, meaning the way that we have it in our Bible, is not an independent book, but part of the Torah, which narrates the story of Israel from the creation of the world through the death of Moses. The Torah in its final form is divided into 5 separate books simply because ancient scrolls couldn't contain a work of that length. So we think of these as like separate books, and we call it, somebody wrote the Bible, but really, I mean, some things are like dictated by practicality. I don't know if you guys have heard this story, but there is the story of the mother who is cooking for her family, let's say, and she cuts off the end, she gets a roast and she cuts off the end and the snout, and she puts it in and she cooks it, and everybody is complicating it. Phyllis says, "Is this fine print?" I don't think so, Phyllis, but I would imagine that there's some parts that have fine print, like the little notes on the side, so you might need a magnifying glass for that. But anyway, this mom, she's cooking for a family. She cooks a pot roast and she cuts off the ends and puts it in the oven and cooks it. And everybody's just going on and they're praising her like, "Oh, Dorothy, this roast, girl, you really put your foot in it this time. You knocked it out of the park, girl. This is awesome. How did you know how to do this?" And she says, "Well, I got this recipe from my mom." Well, an occasion comes about that the same family that she's breaking bread with is now, her mom is there, and they ask her, "Dorothy's mom, this food is amazing. Where did you get the recipe from?" And she says, "I don't know." And well, why does it taste so tender? How is it that the meat falls off the bone? She says, "Well, listen, I cut off the ends and but I don't really know. I got the recipe from my mom. I mean, I did it the way she taught me to do it." And so the occasion comes about that they are meeting now with the great grandma, right? They're meeting with Dorothy's grandmama, and they're sitting down with her, the mom, and Dorothy. And they're saying, "Oh, Dorothy's grandma, listen, let me tell you, this recipe is amazing. Who gave you this recipe? Why you cut the ends off?" And she said, "Well, I didn't really have a pan big enough to fit the pot roast. And so I cut off the ends so that I could put it in the oven and fit in the oven." And so I feel like there are a lot of things in our Bible that we treat as sacred when some of it came out of practicality. That ancient scrolls couldn't couldn't contain Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and so they got hacked into separate texts, and it made it look like there were these 5 separate books, and in fact, it was just one book. Got a comment here. Awesome. All right, so let's jump in. Hold on. All right, so the book of Exodus, it is the foundational text or foundational book of Israel's faith. And what it contains is Israel's declaration of independence and national constitution in one book. It contains the Declaration of Independence for Israel and the national constitution. It says it declares their independence from Egypt and from any other foreign rule. And it also lays out these are the rules by which we are going to be governed. We won't get to this part today, but many people are aware of the 10 Commandments, or what we call the Decalogue. But there is an ethical decalogue, which is the first one, is the one that we all know, which is the "thou shalt not." But there's also a ritual decalogue that really doesn't get talked about a lot, and we'll look at that next week. So it is their constitution. Like, what are the things that are going to govern us in terms of our behavior, and what are the practices that are going to govern us in terms of our celebrations? So it is their national constitution, and it is their Declaration of Independence. Now, what the book of Exodus does is that it connects with the Joseph cycle of Genesis to show how the Hebrew people found themselves in Egypt. It connects with the Joseph cycle to show how the Hebrew people found themselves in Egypt. Now, there has been a lot of attempts to determine whether or not the Exodus actually happened. There is a whole branch of archaeology that is called biblical archaeology, where they are looking to say, did these events happen? And they don't have a lot of evidence. Let me just start there. And so some of the complications is that the things that are attested to in the Bible are not attested to anywhere outside of the Bible in ways that can confirm that something happened. So, for example, I'm looking in the text. I was looking for one thing in particular. So there are a lot of Egyptian elements of the story. For example, the name Moses is an Egyptian name. The Hebrew etymology is actually invented. The Hebrew etymology of the name Moses is actually invented. Moses is an Egyptian name. It has the same ending as like a Ramses. It's basically like the same type of name as Ramses. Um, what they look for in records is that they look to say, well, was there a record of Egypt's defeat to Israel, or was there a record of a massive number of slaves escaping, and basically, Egypt was spoiled. And the thing is that there's no such record. But we do know that Egypt had slaves. And so if there is a historical kernel to the story, it could be that the Pharaoh who enslaved them was Ramses, the greatest builder in ancient Egypt, who built the city named after himself as his new capital in the eastern delta. Ramses also built a series of forts in the delta to secure Egypt's borders, and this is perhaps reflected in the biblical Pharaoh's concern with foreign invasion. While we have no extra biblical, meaning outside the Bible, we have no extra biblical record of the 10 plagues or a mass escape of slaves from Egypt, natural disasters did take place periodically, though so many in rapid succession is implausible. So what they're looking at is that, okay, so we're like thinking about like how, say, the 10 plagues would have been recorded. And essentially there are 10 natural disasters happening back to back to back to back to back. And they feel like, okay, that is so many happening in rapid succession is implausible. And mass escapes of slaves are known from elsewhere in the ancient world. So for example, there was a revolt of 100 slaves in Italy that was led by, 100,000 slaves in Italy led by Spartacus. The fact that Moses is an Egyptian name is consistent with the Israelites having spent time in Egypt. If the Pharaoh of the enslavement was Ramses II, then the Pharaoh under whom the Israelites left Egypt may have been his son, Merneptah, one of whose inscriptions claims a victory over Israel. So again, they're trying to piece it together because, and I may be pronouncing that name incorrectly, but it's Merneptah. So Merneptah, and he lived from 1213 to 1203 BCE. And there's an inscription from the time that he ruled that claims victory over Israel. And so scholars or archaeologists or people who are researching this think that, okay, like kind of like maybe, that like this could have happened. And they say, okay, well, it's not implausible that maybe he was the Pharaoh that Moses was going up against. There's also a group of people, and I was looking for their name, that in Egyptian records that are referred to as Hyperu, and they think that might have been possibly the Hebrew people. So it's, again, they're trying to piece it together. So the thing about this history is that it's not contemporary, meaning that it's not a contemporary account of events. So, for example, if you think about our world, in our world, a contemporary set of events. So right now we are in the midst of stuff. We're in an election year, and we've got all these candidates that are running and for president and trying to get your attention, and someone writing the history, writing today, they're going to have a different perspective than, say, someone sitting in the year 2030 looking back at the year 2020 and explaining what happened in the year 2020 to explain how we got to where we are in 2030. They're going to have a different point of view. There are things that just, I mean, even in 10 years, a lot can change in 10 years. And in that time, perspectives are going to change. I mean, you can look at some of what's happening with the Me Too movement. And I love that people are being called to account in regards to their behavior. But it's also true that our sensibilities were so different 30 years ago. Not that somebody necessarily didn't think that it was wrong, but the culture was different. And it the even just looking at that means that you know, life can change, and we can look back and explain like how we got here. So I want to keep that in mind. I don't want to step in that Me Too. I don't want to get somebody sending me any hate mail because you know, keep your hands to yourself. Time's up for putting your hands on anybody. But I do want to express that there were things that were cultural norms that people worked around and that people dealt with, that that today, in the climate that we're in today, that now they can be called to account of. So I say all that to say this account in Exodus is not an eyewitness account. This is written many centuries later. These are oral traditions that have been passed down through history, and now they are being written down. And so Exodus can be treated as a sequel to Genesis. It is not an independent work that can be separated out of Genesis or separated out of its position with the other books in the Torah. In Egypt, Israel was fruitful and multiplied. Israel was fruitful and multiplied. And the story suggests that the Pharaoh was fearful of the Israelites prospering too much in their country and possibly allying with a foreign power to take them down. Pharaoh's attempts to check the Israelite proliferation would actually unfold in 4 stages and would become more and more oppressive. And so what you see in the story, there are 4 things. So first he starts with trying to get the midwives to kill the firstborn. And what he says is basically, hey, when the kids are born, kill them. And the midwives don't obey him, and they actually thwart him. I'm looking for my notes, y'all, and I'm not. And they thwart him, his plan. And so then he comes back and he just issues like a public decree to kill all of the firstborn in the country, the firstborn child. If you see one, basically kill him. Okay. Then, and one other way that he tries to do it is that he tries to exhaust them in terms of their work. So what would happen is that they would gather straw, and then they would use the Egyptians would gather straw, and then they would provide it to the Hebrews to make bricks. And they had a certain quota that they had to put out. And so what he does is that he stops the Egyptians from supplying the straw, and he says, "Okay, Hebrews, you gotta go get the straw yourself. But I'm not going to give you a break in terms of your production quotas. You have to basically just work harder to make your production quotas, because the Egyptians who were, basically working the assembly line, they've been taken out of the equation. The other thing that happens is that he tries to kill the children. I said that. I was specifically, and I find it. Then he tries to kill the males, and because that would leave only the females, and that would eliminate the potential for Israelite military power. And the thing is that his efforts are to no avail. And then he tells them that, hey, basically, if you see a male child, I want the male child thrown into the Nile. And I thought that this was interesting because this attempt fails also. And ironically, the Nile becomes the means by which Moses is saved and raised by Pharaoh's own daughter, and drowning will become the means of Pharaoh's ultimate defeat. So anyway, I thought those things were interesting, and I wanted to point them out. But what's happening is that he is afraid, and he is stoking fear in everyone else to try to get them to feel that way about the country. Although Moses was a Hebrew, he escaped enslavement, and instead he grew up in the royal palace. Still, he identified with the Hebrews, and he took up their cause. So although Moses was a Hebrew, he escaped enslavement and instead grew up in the royal palace. So I think you guys are aware of the story, but just in case there's anybody that's not aware of the story, because sometimes we know Bible stories, but we don't know necessarily details. His mother, Titan, it says in chapter 2, a certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. So essentially Moses is born into the priestly class. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch, basically like tar. Bitumen is like tar. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. And what happens is that Pharaoh's daughter sees she comes down to bathe in the Nile, and her maidens are walking along the Nile, and she sees the basket among the reeds, and so she sends a slave girl to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. And then she took pity on him, and she said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter. So apparently, Moses' sister, basically starts to interact with Pharaoh's daughter. And she says, "Look, shall I go and get a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him out of the water." So again, just making sure you guys know the details of the story, because I know when I first went through this, I realized that I didn't know the details of the story. I thought he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, and that was the end of the story. But actually, what happens, this type of agreement, they're called wet nursing agreements, and it is where essentially the wet nurse is the person that's there to breastfeed the child, to nurse the child through the nursing beyond nursing age, and then the child is turned back over to the parent. So wet nursing agreements were things that we saw in the ancient Near East. And again, these are scholars looking and saying, hey, are these plausible things that could have happened during this time? Like, how authentic, how true is this story? And what we find is that there were wet nursing agreements that have been found in archaeological records. How did Pharaoh's daughter account for a new baby to her daddy? And why did Pharaoh let the child live? The story doesn't actually give us any evidence to that, because, well, I can't tell you why, because I don't know that. I can only go on the details of the story, but there's not, it's never commented on in the story. Um, Perhaps, being in a royal family, that it was a massive estate. I don't know, but he is raised there, and he is raised in the royal palace. But it's not actually explained in the story. Andrea says, "Good question. I've always wondered myself. Maybe there were so many folks, women, etc., that he did not notice. That's possible too. That's possible too. The story doesn't give us any details. And again, remember, these are not historical accounts, and maybe that question didn't matter to the audience, so it doesn't come up as an explanation. Oftentimes, when you see things explaining why something is the way that it is, they come with some type of explanation. They come with some type of explanation, because that's partly how we get our birth narratives in Matthew and Luke. Mark, which is the first gospel that's written, there's no birth narrative in Mark. But you can tell that later communities that were looking at the life of Jesus, like, where this man come from? And so you have a birth narrative in Matthew, and you have a different birth narrative in Luke, and they don't match. They're two different narratives of how the birth came about. And so these are surviving oral traditions. So the only thing that I can surmise is that it wasn't a question that was important to the community, and so that tradition didn't survive, say, the oral form translating into the written form. Moses was born to Levite parents named Amram and Jochebed. Amram and Jochebed. And what's interesting is that his parents are not named until the 6th chapter. Like we're pretty far into the story before we actually learn the names of Moses' parents. And we find that out in Exodus 6 and chapter 6 and verse 20. He was placed in a basket and set afloat on the river, and he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the Egyptian court. Moses came to the rescue of an abused Hebrew slave by killing the Egyptian. In danger of being arrested, Moses fled into Midian, where he found refuge. I want to stop here a little bit and just kind of give you some additional details on this part of the story. So what's happening is that we don't really know anything about Moses' childhood. Literally, the story just gets him to adulthood. His mom gives birth to him. She nurses him until he's too big to hide, to basically hide the fact that he's a infant male child. And then she prayerfully puts him in a basket, puts him in the reeds on the Nile, and prayerfully lets him go. Moses' sister hides to kind of see like what happens. Pharaoh's daughter sees him when she comes down to the Nile to bathe. She finds a child. She communicates with Moses' sister. Moses' sister goes back and gets the mama. The mama establishes a wet nursing agreement between her and Pharaoh's daughter. She takes care of the child, and then when he is done nursing, basically turns him over to Pharaoh's daughter, and he is raised in the house of Pharaoh. And that's basically it. We don't have any incidents of him as a child. We don't have anything. The first inkling that we get of his personality comes in chapter 2. The first inkling that we get of his personality comes in chapter 2. If you go to Exodus chapter 2, verse 11, it says, sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinfolk and witnessed their labors. And so the other thing is that he knows he's Hebrew. It's like he's not in the dark. It's not like he is raised and thinks that he is Egyptian. According to the story, he's aware that he is not Egyptian. So it says that he witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and he sat down beside a well. So I think one of the things that's really powerful about this story, again, not putting metaphysics on it, but just looking at what is on the page. And one of the things that's just interesting about what's on the page is that at a very early age, or the first indication that we have, Moses is very concerned with justice. He's very concerned with defending the defenseless. And he's very concerned with right and wrong. And it's one of my positions theologically, but just philosophically, that who we are as people is who we're always becoming. And the beginning form may not look like the end form, but what the interests are don't really change. They just get refined over a person's lifetime. And when you look at Moses, he's constantly interested in justice, and it's this idea that won't let him go, and it's something that he wrestles with all his life until finally he has to do something about it. And he runs away in a very real way from this interest, or from what's calling on his life. And he's very, while he's interested in self, he is unwilling to make the sacrifice that it takes to be the leader that he's born to be. But it's all there in the very beginning. And I think if you look at your own life, that you will see the same thing, that the things that some things change from your 20s and your 30s into your 40s and your 50s and your 60s. But some things don't change. And there's some things that have been with you all your life. They are the call on your life. And if you will finally look at them, it will open up doors for you to begin to live and operate in your purpose. And even if you go to the next verse, and verse 16 on chapter 2. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and fill the trough to water their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense and he watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him in to break bread." Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as wife. She bore a son whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." So 2 things I want to point out to you there. One, again, when a character acts in a story, it gives us a chance to see their character. And one more time, we see Moses standing up for someone who, for whatever reason, doesn't have the ability or the capacity to defend himself. What we can see too is that they thought that he was an Egyptian. Maybe that comes later in the story. I want to point that out to you guys. I think it comes later in the story. No, it's right there in verse 19. They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds." So it's a really interesting story, because when Moses leaves, he looks one way. Even though he's Hebrew, he's been so conditioned in the Egyptian world that he looks like the world that he came from. It would be like him coming from corporate America. There's just a way that he carries himself. In fact, I have a friend, he looks completely different now, but he worked for a private bank, and he was a private banker for very high net worth individuals. And whenever I was around him, he was always suited and booted. And then he had a career change, and all of a sudden, he grew a beard. And I know he would never do that in a corporate setting. And so I think of Moses in that way, that he comes in looking like the Egyptians. You know, he's got his Egyptian whatever he's got on. And so even though he's Hebrew, he's got on this Egyptian facade. And what happens over the course of those 40 years in Midian, and we'll get to that, is that the Egyptian in him is drained out until what is left is the Hebrew who can't let go of the idea of justice for all. But I'm sorry. So those are the two things that I wanted to point out to you. I feel like there was one more. Oh, this is a big one. So I put this little teaser, and I didn't get any replies back in the email. So y'all didn't read Exodus. Maybe you needed a little bit more notice to read Exodus. But I wanted to look for evidence of the different sources. And one of them is right in verse 18. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, whatever he said. But if you know the story, later in the story, they call Zipporah's father Jethro. Well, which is it? Is it Reuel or is it Jethro? And what you get is how almost seamlessly the redactor has woven this story together. And there are other things like that. I'll point those things out as we go. But the evidence of the hand is in there. Alita says, I always wondered how he knew he was Hebrew. And Constance says, thank you for that. The beginning form may not look pretty, but who you are, you must become. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. Moses settled into the Midian desert and worked as a shepherd under his father-in-law, Jethro. Remember, the father-in-law is called Reuel in one of those, in that first verse when we meet him in verse 18. Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush marked a turning point in Israel's history. Now, this is in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 is a turning point in Israel's history. Moses is commissioned to return to Egypt and engineer the release of the Israelites. Moses is commissioned to return to Egypt and engineer the release of the Israelites. So, you know, it's unfortunate that we have been taught to look at these stories the way that we have, or maybe fortunate, I don't know. But the thing that is always the same is the way that consciousness functions. This universe is faithful. Part of the reason that we can read these stories and understand them is because trees always act like trees. They never start acting like water. Water always acts like water. The sun always acts like the sun. Birds always act like birds. Bees always act like bees. People always act like people. Like there is this faithfulness to the universe. So when we're reading these stories, sometimes we're tempted to believe that, oh, things function differently with God back in the day, as opposed to this is how they talked about their experience with God. And so Malala says amen. So sometimes we read these stories and we're like, oh, like God was right there in the desert speaking and a voice was coming out of the bush. And, you know, it just is, it's just unfortunate that happens. Because I think that we lose so much in that way. And I wish there were a different way. So that said, I want to offer the idea that perhaps this is the way that Moses is talking about what it means for this idea of justice to have a hold on him in such a way that it will not let him go. And maybe because of his environment and the way he thinks about his world, that it feels like this bush that is burning and won't stop burning. And so my question to you is, what is the bush in your life that's burning and won't stop burning? And it is something that he has cared about. And in his youth, he tried to handle it in human ways. But as he has matured under the guidance of Jethro or Ruel, depending on which source we're reading from, that he has now learned to respond to it in divine ways. And perhaps this conversation back and forth between him and the Lord or Yahweh is really an internal struggle that he's having with whether or not he should take action. It's been 40 years. Should I really go back? I'm living in relative peace. Why do I need to go? And look, I got all these problems. I don't only speak well. And are they going to listen to me? I don't have any credibility with them. I ran away. It's like, if we could understand that consciousness never stops functioning like consciousness, and that perhaps there is another way to look at this story, not putting metaphysics on it, but that opens a door for us to see what it is for somebody to wrestle with an idea that won't let them go. And I think that all of us have an idea like that just won't let us go. That even though we are 70 years old, it's still resonating in us. We still care about it. It still gets us going. And we feel like we must do something about it. And I'm suggesting, as an alternative, that perhaps this is a way to consider Moses' story instead of trying to convince your 21st century brain that there could be a bush that would burn and not be consumed. Okay. Jack says, I can relate, though I've never actually spoken to Thank you, Jack. Yes. Andrew says the bush could be an intervention. Exactly. Yes. 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 That doesn't make it any less God. It doesn't make it any less holy. And perhaps this is him discovering how God speaks to him in the form of this idea that won't let him go. The other thing that happens is that Moses learns the identity of God who would deliver the Hebrew people from bondage. Moses discovers the identity of God who would deliver the Hebrew people from bondage. Now, this is really interesting. I'm going to see if I can pull up these notes really quickly. I think this is really interesting because the way that it's described in the story is that it seems to suggest, hold on, y'all. It seems to suggest that God is revealing something new to Moses. Let me get to the scripture, and it says, I'm reading verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites? And he said, I will be with you, God sees, that shall be your sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Moses said to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Aye, Asher, Aye. He continued, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Aye sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus you shall speak to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever, this my appellation for all eternity. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have taken note of you and of what is being done to you in Egypt, and I have declared, I will take you out. And it goes on from there. There's something I'm looking for specifically. One of the things that God says to Moses is that I didn't reveal myself to them. I can't find the verse immediately. I'm just give me a second. I'm gonna search through. Okay. Um, So Moses says, "May I say who sent me?" He asks for God's name, and the Israelites would want to know who sent me, and God replies with a sentence, Aye, Asher, Aye. This is the first person sentence that can be translated, I am who I am, or perhaps I will be who I will be, or perhaps I cause to be what I cause to be. We really actually don't know, but it has something to do with being. That's what we do know. It has something to do with me being. Um, There are certain important and unique features of this burning bush dialogue. First, God identifies himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as numerous commentators have pointed out, in doing so, the biblical writer is trying to establish an unbroken historic continuity between the present revelation to Moses and the revelations and promises that are received by Israel's forefathers, the patriarchs, who we just studied the last couple of weeks. And yet, paradoxically, the very assertion of continuity only serves to underscore a fundamental discontinuity. Because even as God asserts that he is the God of the patriarchs, he reveals to Moses a new name, Yahweh, so that Yahwism and the Yahweh cult can be said to begin only with Moses. And the biblical sources, they differ on this point. So, for example, the J source we see in Genesis 4:26, the earliest humans worship Yahweh as Yahweh. So how is it that I'm giving you a new name? The name was always known. And so J wants to assert a direct continuity between God, the God of the patriarchs, and the God of Exodus. But the P and the E sources tell it a little differently. And so in Exodus chapter 6, a couple chapters later, there's this passage that they assign to P, and what God says here, if you go to chapter 6, verses 2 through 4, he says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, or the Almighty One, or the mighty breasted one, but I did not make myself known to them by my name. Now, this contradicts the J source, and many scholars have suggested that P and E preserve a memory of a time when Israel worshipped the Canaanite god El. And P and E wish to claim that the God who covenanted with the patriarchs is the God of Exodus, but now with a new name. So anyway, my point is that I wanted to point out that these source things are right in there, like woven. I mean, that redactor was doing some work, right? And so I just want to point this out because I want you to be able to look at your Bible and to be able to see it, so that with whatever decision you make on about the Bible for yourself, that you're making an informed decision, whatever that is. And I don't see these things as faith shakers. I just don't consider them that way. Moses was commissioned by God to go to the ruler of Egypt and demand the release of the Israelites. Going to Pharaoh, Moses functions as a prophet. That is to say, he is a messenger delivering a message in the name of God. Now, Moses actually raises 5 objections to his assignment, but God overcomes each one. And you can see that in chapter 3, verse 11 to chapter 4, verse 17. And one of the things that I think it was in the Jewish Bible that was pointed out is that the vindication of God's name is the main theme of the plague. The vindication of God's name. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's like God is protecting his name. And there is a minister that I like, that I think is out of the Bahamas. He's made his transition now. And he has this theological position that I always thought was interesting. And I would always say, God, how would I talk about that in New Thought? But I'll tell you what he says. He talks about, he builds this metaphor of God being the manufacturer and that we are the manufactured parts. And he talks about the manufacturer being deeply vested in protecting the manufacturer's name. And he has this famous sermon that I love, one that I've listened to a lot, where he says that that if you look at, if you have an Apple product, looking for a product that I have, but well, here, you have this product, right? I have this microphone, and when you open this thing, there is a warranty that's in here, and they want you to fill this out and send this back. And if something goes wrong with the product, well, one, they want to be able to trace where the product is. But if something goes wrong with the product, they don't even want you to fix it yourself. They want you to send it back to the manufacturer. Because if you have a bad experience, you might get on Twitter, you might get on Facebook, you might tell your friends. Essentially, you having a bad experience with their product can mess up the name of the company. And the name of a company is valuable. It in itself is a type of currency. If you think about a name like Rolls Royce and what that means and all that implies. If you think about a name like Sears, and what you think of Sears for, that name has currency and it has value. And a manufacturer is going to, well, Sears isn't a manufacturer, but you know what I mean, that they're going to back up their product for their name's sake. And so it was something that he kept saying. He talked about God being vested in your overcoming, your delivery for his name's sake. And we've seen that in most famously in Psalm 23, that what God does for you, yes, Dr. Brenda, what God does for you, he does for his name's sake. And I just love that metaphor, and it always just resonated with me. And it was something I would mull over because it's just a different theological position. But I like that says something to me. Andrew says it's actually very empowering for his name's sake, right? So that really resonated with me just on a gut level. And this idea that what God does for you, he does for his name's sake. And he really helped you understand that, if you buy something from Apple, they have a whole way that they want their stuff handled. And don't you go trying to fix it yourself. Come back to the manufacturer, because the manufacturer wants to protect their name. And he talked about understanding his relationship with God in that way. And so when I came across this, unrelated to that minister, anyway, in the Jewish Bible, I took the cut off, in the Jewish Bible, and it talked about the plague being that the main theme is the vindication of God's name. The main theme in those plagues is the vindication of God's name. I just thought that was really powerful. I really did. I just that stayed with me, so I wanted to share that with you guys. Because anyway, I just love ideas that get you going. All right. Pharaoh refused to obey God's commands. His lack of response is variously attributed to Pharaoh's hardening of his own heart or God hardening Pharaoh's heart. One of the things I think that doesn't get talked about enough is that these encounters with Pharaoh. And the encounters with Pharaoh are progressive. They are progressive, and they are they change in terms of their degree, I was looking for something specific I wanted to say. I want to give you, I should have written this down and thought of, or highlighted it. Um, they change in terms of their degree, and they change in terms of who they affect, and they get more and more personal until finally they essentially they start to escalate. But the other thing that you see in the story is that there is this evolution that's happening with Moses in terms of how he is showing up. And through the process of going back and forth to Pharaoh, through the process of going and advocating for the freedom of the Israelites and trying different things and trying to negotiate different ways, you see this type of confidence that is being established in him. And it's in the language. It's very subtle. But again, it's like you have to look at the language. Like he starts out back in chapter 4, where he wants to do something, and he finally says, okay, I'll go. But he's like, I don't talk very well. I'm slow of speech and slow of thought, and I got all these impediments, and I ain't got no credibility with the people because I left, and like he basically throws up all of these objections. And then by the time you see him get to probably about the 7th or 8th plague, there is this confidence that he has where it's almost like he starts to take command and he starts to act, and he's following God's guidance, but there is this assuredness in his speech that he doesn't have any, that he didn't have, excuse me, in the beginning. And it's really powerful watching that. And I think sometimes that just gets lost because these stories, they're, in my opinion, get shrunk down to their like lowest common denominator. And so I feel like there's so much power in some of the nuance of the story. And it made me think about my own journey, things that I've had to come back to again and again and again. And if I will keep coming back to it, there's a confidence that I will get if I persist. Now, if I give up, the confidence isn't built. But if I keep coming back to it, no matter how long it takes, that there is this assuredness that develops. The other thing that happens is that they establish a ritual. And we will get to that. Hold on, I want to show you this. Ms. Desmond, you said Moses stuttered, and yes, he did. But it's interesting because, again, evidence of the two different sources. Depending on the source, whatever he's dealing with, whether it's a stutter or some other type of speech impediment, is actually talked about differently. Meaning the Hebrew words themselves are different. And I thought that was interesting. Oh, the other thing. This is backtracking a little bit. I have so much data in my head that I want to share with you. I found out that the word for basket that's translated as basket that Moses is put in is the same word that's used for ark. That meaning, and the ark referring to Noah, and it's the only two places in the Torah that that word is used. And so it's this recurring theme. You've got the ark, of course, that saves Noah and the families that are on there with him. And then you have this ark that is used again. And interestingly enough, it's not the same word that gets translated as Ark of the Covenant. That's a different ark, a different Hebrew word there. Okay. So the Israelites did not experience the devastating 10th plague. Moses instructed each Israelite family to kill a lamb as a substitute for its firstborn. They painted the blood from the slaughtered lamb on the door frames of their homes. When God saw this evidence of the sacrifice on a house, he would pass over that house, sparing its firstborn son. The avoidance of the 10th plague developed into a ceremonial meal called the Passover. The avoidance of the 10th plague developed into a ceremonial meal called the Passover. So this is where we're going to stop tonight. So I want to stop here. I want to take any questions, but I just wanted to get us to them getting through the 10th plague, and then they're going to be expelled from Egypt. And so we're going to pick up next week with pages 32 and 33, and we're going to, because I want to spend some extra time with the Decalogue, with those the ritual Decalogue. That everybody's familiar with the ethical Decalogue, which are the thou shall not. That are found in Exodus 20, but I want to also look at the ritual Decalogue that's found in Exodus chapter 34. Andrea says, wonderful. When you think you are not up to the job, know that if you move forth in faith, the infinite has placed all that is needed right within you. You can do more than you know. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Any other questions? Any other questions or comments or takeaways from this? Thank you, Ms. Des. Ms. Des, I got to pray out. Yes, ma'am. I know you're on the East Coast. let me take this time. There are no other questions or comments. Thank y'all for hanging with me tonight. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I just want to take this moment to just bless you. I want to speak life over you, and I want to thank God for his presence in you. And I want to thank God for just working with you with wherever you are, to remind you that you are gifted, you are talented, you are loved, you are amazing beyond measure, and that I see for you the greatest expression of God coming through. In the name and nature of Jesus the Christ, I bless you, and so it is, and amen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was wonderful, Ms. Desmond. Have a great night.